In this lesson, we're going to talk about GPT partitioning. GPT stands for GUID partition table. It's called GUID partition table because every partition on the drive has a globally unique identifier, or GUID. That means that each partition worldwide would have its own unique identifying number. GPT is a new standard that's gradually replacing MBR, or Master Boot Record. GPT is associated with UEFI, and since UEFI replaces the legacy BIOS with something more modern, GPT replaces the MBR partitioning system with something more modern. MBR partitioning dates back to the early 1980s. In the late 1990s, Intel developed a new partition table format that became part of UEFI. As of 2010, GPT became a subset of the UEFI specification. So, how does GPT compare with MBR partitions? Let's look at both of their characteristics. GUIDs are used to identify partition types. This provides a way to independently identify and reference partitions and disks. A GPT disk can be basic or dynamic, just like an MBR disk can be basic or dynamic. GPT disks also support up to 128 partitions depending on space allocated for the partition table, instead of the 4 primary partitions limited to MBR. There is no need for extended and logical partitions. A GPT disk can support between 8 and 9.4 zettabytes depending on the sector size. An MBR partition table is limited to 2.2 terabytes. GPT keeps a backup of the partition table at the end of the disk that aids in recovery in case the primary ones are damaged. On an MBR disk, the partitioning and boot data is stored in one place. If this data is overwritten or corrupted, you're in trouble. But a GPT disk stores multiple copies of this data across the disk, so it's much more robust and can recover if the data is corrupted. GPT also stores cyclic redundancy check, or CRC values, to check that its data is intact. If the data is corrupted, GPT notices the problem and attempts to recover the damaged data from another location on the disk. MBR has no way of knowing if the data is corrupted. You would only see that there was a problem when the boot process failed or the partitions vanished. GPT drives also include a protective MBR. This protective MBR sees the GPT drive as a single partition that extends across the entire drive. So, if you try to manage a GPT disk with an old tool that can only read MBRs, it'll see the GPT disk as a single partition that extends across the entire drive. The protective MBR makes sure that the old tools don't mistake the GPT drive for a non-partitioned drive and overwrite all your data. You'll probably want to use GPT when setting up a drive, but if you need compatibility with old systems, like the ability to boot Windows off a drive on a computer with a traditional BIOS, you'll need to use MBR. Windows can only boot from GPT if it's a UEFI-based computer running 64-bit versions of Windows 7 and newer, and the corresponding server versions. All versions of Windows 7 and newer can read GPT drives and use them for data, but they just can't boot from them without UEFI. Because Windows 7 doesn't support UEFI on 32-bit platforms, you can't boot from a GPT partition on Windows 7. Other operating systems can use GPT. Linux has built-in support for GPT. Apple's Intel Macs no longer use the Apple Partition Table, or APT scheme, but use GPT instead. So let's review some important things about GPT partitioning. GPT is a new standard that's gradually replacing MBR. With GPT, you can have basic and dynamic disks and 128 partitions that hold more space. GPT also aids in the recovery of your primary partitions if they become corrupted.